The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. My name is Dave Tyrrell-Wysocki. I'm the director here at the Mackey Loeb School. And the question I always ask, how many of you have never been in the building before? Great. It's my 30-second moment then. Mackey Loeb School has been here for 16 years, offering free classes and low-cost workshops on all kinds of communications-related topics: writing, social media, photography, First Amendment, cartooning, public relations, and new session of classes starts in a couple of weeks. I have schedules, and I can talk to you about the classes after if you'd like. When they started the school, I think the intent was that it would be mostly high school students and maybe younger. It's turned out that it's mostly adults, some of whom are here. Hi, Joe, and Neil, and Paul, and others. A lot of adults, and many of the adults actually work at nonprofits. So they come here because they see the word free and learn how to better present their nonprofits around the state. So support for the school helps spread the work of nonprofits all over New Hampshire. So we're really proud of that. It's nonprofit, nonpartisan, students of all ages taught by professionals in the field, people who compete all day, gathering news in business, in court, the lawyers who are instructors here, and then cooperate here, spreading their knowledge with students. So we think it's kind of a special place. So if you have any questions about the school, I'll be glad to answer them afterward. About 2 months ago, an email landed in my inbox, and it said, "Hi, maybe you remember me. My name's Bill Sanderson. I worked at the Concord Monitor when you were at the AP in the early 80s. We're actually in the same building in the early 80s, different floor. I worked for the Associated Press, which tonight is going to take a beating in the presentation." Actually, I think the AP person that day was the only one who actually gave a beating, but he took a bigger beating professionally, and Bill will talk all about that. Bill Sanderson has written an amazing book about some of the behind-the-scenes drama that went on during one of the most dramatic days of the 20th century. And it's not just about reporters deciding what to write, but where to go, being in the right place at the right time, but doing the right thing. And all of these things are flying around, and as you listen to this story, think of the audio you were just hearing and what it would be like today in Dealey Plaza, where one guy had a movie going. Now you would have had yours going. Everyone would have had theirs going. One guy apparently had a movie of this whole thing. Well, Bill Sanderson will tell the story of one guy who was in the press car, who was in the right place at the right time and told the right thing. John Clayton, former reporter, author, now director of the Manchester Historic Association, is going to help Bill with the presentation and make it a conversation instead of a lecture. And that means it's a conversation with you too. So if you have questions, they're reporters. They get paid to raise their hand. Not even raise their hand, they get paid to interrupt people all day. So feel free to interrupt with questions. So Bill Sanderson, John Clayton.
Good?
Yep.
We'll see if we really need the microphone or not.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll try to work without it, and if you have a problem, let me know, and I'll take it from David, but I think this group is intimate enough that we can get by without it. So, Bill, reporter to reporter, I look out at this crowd. We're not supposed to assume that, right? If you're a reporter and you assume, you make an ass of you and me, so we don't do that. But I'm assuming that most of the people in this audience probably remember November 22nd, 1963.
I would guess. Where should we start? Should we start with what happened in the wire car and how Merriman Smith got this story?
No.
Okay.
Let's start with why, after 53 years, you saw a book here.
Three years ago, I got a phone call from an editor at the New York Observer. I was looking for freelance assignments. She called me up and asked me to write something about the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. And I was familiar with the story that's told in the book about Merriman Smith and how he scooped his competitor that day. But I didn't know the whole story. I proceeded with this assignment. It was not an assignment strictly about the reporting of the story, but it was a story about it was a TikTok, what we call in the news business. It was a moment by moment how the news unfolded that day, what had happened. And as part of the story, I began talking to some reporters who were there because some of them are still around. And that got me the idea of doing a book because Merriman Smith, and everybody calls him Smitty, and I lapsed into that because I've lived with this for so long. Smitty was the man that day. He was the guy who really got the story. When Walter Cronkite read the dispatch on TV, he was reading Smitty's dispatch. Smitty was the guy who put this story on the wire ahead of anybody else. And the next day, he wrote, for morning newspapers on Saturday, he wrote a remarkable story of everything he did and saw that day that deservedly won a Pulitzer Prize. And I reproduced the story in my book just because it just seemed like such an interesting piece of journalism.
Very good. So, Smitty.
Yes.
I'm going to call him Smitty too, is that all right? We're on intimate terms here, again, right? A small audience, you can use nicknames. Smitty engaged in a kind of journalism that I call total immersion.
Right.
He had a beat,
Right.
but he didn't limit his beat to, I'm only talking to the press secretary, I'm only talking to a treasury secretary and such. Talk about how he was totally immersed in the White House beat.
Smitty started his newspaper career in the mid-1930s. He was a guy who dropped out of college to get a job as a reporter. And late in the 1930s, he went to work for the United Press, which is the predecessor to United Press International. He did very well, working out of the UP's Atlanta bureau mostly, and he was promoted very rapidly. In 1940, they moved him to Washington. And they would try him out on different beats to figure out where he worked best. And they decided that he was very suited to covering the White House. So a few months before Pearl Harbor, sometime in the fall of 1941, they assigned Smitty to the White House. And there he stayed. He stayed on the White House beat for UP and then for United Press International right up until 1970, from the Roosevelt to the first part of the Nixon administration. And he was the kind of beat reporter who didn't just rely on handouts. He traveled with the president everywhere. He spent a lot of time during World War II traveling around the country with President Roosevelt on trips that he was not allowed to report about. There were three reporters on these trips. There would be someone from the UP, someone from the AP, and someone from INS, which is a third forgotten wire service today, International News Service. And sometimes they didn't get to write stories about what Roosevelt did until after they got back. By then, some of it was pretty useless. But President Roosevelt called them his ghouls. He said, you reporters tag along with me because you're waiting for something to happen to me, aren't you? And they said, no, we're waiting in case something happens. We're just in case something happens. We're not waiting for something to happen. But if something does happen, we're there. So President Roosevelt said, you reporters are my ghouls, aren't you? And that's how Roosevelt referred to them.
That's interesting. We're going to divert a little bit away because
Sure.
you brought up President Roosevelt. If Smitty was that close to him and spent that much time with him, I think you all know that President Roosevelt was afflicted with polio as a child, which affected his mobility throughout his life.
Right.
But there was an unspoken bond amongst reporters and the elected official that only so much would be dissolved.
The reporters never talked about this at all. They never talked about President Roosevelt's health problems. They never talked about the fact that he could not walk, that he needed assistance when he was ever seen standing up. He always had a Secret Service agent or an aide holding him up. He simply couldn't do this. And this was never discussed. Towards the end of Roosevelt's life, I think when he came back from the Yalta conference, he gave a speech to a session of Congress in which he mentioned this. He referred to his disability, and interestingly, the New York Times printed a transcript of the whole speech, and they pointed out that they quoted President Roosevelt talking about the fact he had several pounds of metal on his legs, and they'd forgive him if he gave his speech sitting down for a change. But the reporting of the speech never mentioned that part. The reporters never wrote about that in their stories.
I only bring it up now because in the course of this discussion, we're going to talk about how journalism has changed through the years. And I think that's a telling specific that we can touch back on when we look at how things are different today. So a press secretary for President Eisenhower lived in fear of Smitty because of the depth of his connections.
He knew everybody in the White House. He knew people who were, he knew gardeners, he knew every presidential aide, he knew all the Secret Service agents, and he knew the president himself. So Smitty knew everybody from the top to the bottom of the operation. And I learned this after after the book came out. There was a very interesting story during Eisenhower's presidency about squirrels on the White House lawn. And President Eisenhower had a putting green, and the squirrels were leaving their acorns around the green or something, and this apparently got Eisenhower very mad. So he went to a great deal of effort enlisting all kinds of government agencies to get rid of the squirrels. And Smith heard about this, and he wrote a story about how they had some kind of sound system. They were going to scare the squirrels away with, with a sound. They were going to try to trap them. Finally, Smitty reported that they were trapping the squirrels and then driving them off to a park somewhere and letting them loose. And Smith reported all this. What I found out only a few weeks ago was that it was Secret Service agents who told Smith this. He never revealed who his sources were, but one of Smith's colleagues said, yeah, he got that story from the Secret Service, that story. It infuriated Eisenhower. He just didn't know what to do when this came out in the papers. And it also caused something of a kerfuffle in Washington because Democratic senators were coming out saying, well, these squirrels are my squirrels too. They belong to all of America. The White House squirrels, they should be left alone.
Imagine going to jail because you wouldn't reveal that Secret Service people told you who was capturing the squirrels.
Right.
The journalistic oath. I'll use the term protagonist for
Okay.
Smitty. He's the star of your book.
Right.
And if you have a protagonist, you have to have an antagonist. Just kind of set us up with Smitty's counterpart at the Associated Press.
Okay. On November 22nd, 1963, Smitty was UPI's star White House reporter. He went to Dallas to cover President Kennedy's motorcade that day. He was with President Kennedy all through his trip to Texas. And the Associated Press sent two Washington reporters on that trip. One was the regular White House correspondent, a guy named Frank Cormier. And the other was a man named Jack Bell. Now, Jack Bell didn't usually cover the White House. He was a guy who was a specialist in Congress. His real specialty was the United States Senate. Jack Bell probably knew more about the U.S. Senate than any other news reporter. When they arrived in Dallas, they get off the press plane, and they were going to Smitty and was going to ride in what they called the wire car. This was what we call a White House pool car. The White House would always arrange for the two wire service reporters and then two other reporters they picked more or less at random to ride closer to the president than the rest of the press corps. It's in the book. I think there were 58 Washington journalists on that trip. Most of them were writers, but there's some photographers and some technical people in that number. And Smitty was going to ride in the wire car, which was always his job, and kind of his privilege as the UPI reporter there. Now, normally the Associated Press also had a reporter in the wire car. Normally, that would have been Frank Cormier, the White House correspondent of the Associated Press. But Jack Bell was the senior AP guy on the scene, and he wanted to ride in the wire car that day. He thought, this is a political story going on in Texas, the size of the crowds, the cheering that the president gets are part of the story that I'm trying to write about politics, and plus, he never got to ride in presidential motorcades very much. So he kind of big-footed Frank Cormier out of the wire car that day. He said, I'll ride in the wire car that day. And according to some of some of the reporters at the time, Frank Cormier said, all right, I'll go sit back in the press bus. He liked being with the other reporters. He was a little more social. It was fine. He had no quarrel with that.
I'm going to fast forward a little bit because we all know the ending of the story, right?
Right.
I'm not going to, spoiler alert, if you don't know, plug your ears. So the presidential motorcade is riding through Gilly Plaza.
Right.
By the Texas School Book Depository.
Right.
I'm just using words that I know you know because they've become part of the American lexicon today. The grassy knoll, the lone gunman, all of these things that come into play. The limousines riding along, and all of a sudden there were three loud reports.
The press car, the press pool car, in which Merriman Smith wrote, I think we have to back up a little bit.
Okay.
Merriman Smith was the most aggressive White House reporter. I mean, he insisted when he got into the press pool car, if there was a radio telephone in the press pool car, he liked to sit next to it. Well, there was a radio telephone in this pool car, and Smith made a point of sitting in the front, in the middle, with the phone right in front of him. Now think of today where everybody has a telephone in their pocket. This was the only thing like a mobile phone that was available to any of these 58 Washington reporters on the trip. Smitty was sitting right next to it, in the front seat. In the back seat of the car was I'm going to start calling him poor Jack Bell from the Associated Press. They're going through Dealey Plaza, and they hear 3 shots. Boom, boom, boom. And some of the reporters thought, oh, firecrackers, explosion. That was Jack Bell's first thought. They sounded like firecrackers. But Smitty was a gun guy. He liked hunting, he liked shooting. He sometimes, I heard, took practice with the Secret Service agents at their gun range. So he knew right away what they were. He said, those were gunshots. He picked up the radio telephone, and he put through a call to the UPI Dallas Bureau. And he yelled into the phone, 3 shots fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas. Now, the shots were fired at exactly 12:30 in the afternoon. Smitty got that dispatch to a man in the UPI Dallas Bureau named Bill Hampton. Wilbur Hampton was his byline. And he typed it, Wilbur Hampton typed this up, and he typed it on, I had to explain in the book what carbon paper is. My editor said to me, you're saying you typed this up in carbon paper, but you're not telling anybody what that is, and people won't know. Well, yeah, I had to figure out a way to explain it. So he typed it up on what they called a book. It was several sheets of paper separated by carbon paper, so there'd be copies of what he typed. When he was done with the dispatch, he handed it to a guy called a puncher, a teletype operator. And then he handed another copy to his boss, a man named Jack Fallon, who was the chief he's the chief editor in the UPI Dallas Bureau. And there was some, Jack, look at this. You know, he had to get Fallon's attention because Jack Fallon was worried about something else. He didn't really want to pay attention to this young reporter who was typing up what he thought were probably just notes from Smitty. What is it? You know, what is this? And here's what I wrote. And Jack Fallon read it. And he yelled at the puncher, send it! So they put this on the wire. This dispatch got on the wire at 12:34 p.m., 4 minutes after the shooting. Back in the wire car. They're on their way to Parkland Hospital. They aren't really sure they're on their way to Parkland Hospital. They heard the shots. They saw the president's car zoom off. These guys, the reporters in the wire car are not from Dallas, so they're not really sure what direction they're going in. And Smitty is talking with Jack Fallon, his editor in the Dallas Bureau, about follow-up dispatches. And poor Jack Bell in the back seat says he wants his turn on the phone. He wants to call the AP and tell the AP what he's just seen. And Smith wouldn't give him the phone. He scrunched down under the seat like this and kept talking to his editor. And he was yelling into the phone, and some people, the other reporters in the wire car wondered why he was yelling, because they thought he had a pretty good connection. They thought, well, we can hear the other person in the line just fine. So why is he yelling? Maybe it was a ruse. Who can say? Jack Bell started punching him. Jack Bell started throwing punches and trying to grab the phone away, and Smith just scrunched down and held on and held it to his ear and kept talking. And Jack Bell said, give me the goddamn phone, and Smith wouldn't give it to him. This keeps up all the way to Parkland Hospital. They get to Parkland Hospital at 12:36 p.m., 6 minutes after the shooting. And Smith and the other 2 reporters in the wire car, one was a man named Robert Baskin, who worked for the Dallas Morning News, and the other was a guy named Bob Clark, who worked for ABC News. They jump out of the car and they run up to Kennedy's limousine. Jack Bell now has his chance to use the phone. He calls the AP Dallas Bureau and he says, this is Jack Bell, and then the line goes dead. He couldn't get it. He couldn't get his dispatch out at all. So there were 3 reporters run up to President Kennedy's limousine, which remember was an open-top limousine. It was convertible. And they look in the back. And Smith described for his readers in a story the next day what he saw. He saw the governor of Texas with a bullet wound to his chest. He saw the president lying cradled in his wife's lap, and she was whispering in his ears, and he couldn't quite see what his wound was like, but there was blood all over the place. It was horrible. And Smith turned to a Secret Service agent he knew, a guy named Clint Hill, who was the author of several books about the assassination, and he was still around. And Smitty said to Clint Hill, "How bad was he hit, Clint?" And Clint Hill said to him, "He's dead, Smitty." Now, they didn't really know what to do. Smitty wasn't quite sure what to do with this information. So he ran into the hospital, and he dictated another dispatch to the UPI Bureau, which, through some complications in the Bureau, came out as President Kennedy seriously wounded, perhaps seriously, perhaps fatally. UPI moved that as a flash, which is the highest priority of wire service news. And I think that moved at 12:39, if my memory is working correctly. And then a few minutes later, they moved a follow-up to that dispatch, in which he quoted Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent, by name. "He's dead," said Clint Hill, Mrs. Kennedy's Secret Service agent, because Hill was assigned to Mrs. Kennedy. And that moved on the wire, if my memory serves, it's 12:41. So I think it's kind of interesting that he got a quote by name from the Secret Service agent and put that on the wire at 12:41, he's dead. Everybody by then knew this was very serious business. And some people in Kennedy's circle, when they heard Clint Hill quoted saying this in the book, I heard this from Clint Hill himself, he told me this. John Kenneth Galbraith was having lunch, and he heard on the radio Clint Hill quoted by name saying the president was dead. And Clint Hill was very well regarded. They knew, that's it. Clint Hill says so.
Because of Bill's book, there's been talk about creating a must-see movie like Spotlight. If you did not see it, that was how the Boston Globe covered the Catholic Church scandal. And to do so, you have to think like a screenwriter, envision this. Some of you don't know, but I used to work in the wire service room at the Lowell Sun when I was in college. And for the scene that Bill just described, when the ticker tape machines are going, they're typing it out, and at the same time, there's another smaller machine that's punching out a strip of paper tape in which the code that would go into the typesetting machines would process and would actually print the paper the way it was. There were guys at the paper who could read the tape with their fingers just by the punches. They could tell what was said. So imagine bing, 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 3 bells flash.
Right.
The bells start going off, the type machines start clattering, and the drama of that moment could be very easily portrayed in the film. If you are so fortunate as to be the subject of a major motion picture, who would play you?
Not me. It's a little news to me that everyone wants to make a movie.
You would be the voice of a narrator in the back, and Smitty would be the star. So
in my mind, I have Tom Hanks as Smitty, and I have Billy Bob Thornton as Jack Bell.
You have to think visually. It's all about the film now. Another element of technology, Walter Cronkite was the first one to read the news, and I think many of you have probably seen that film countlessly. When he reads it, takes his glasses off, and clearly moved. What changed in television journalism because of that moment?
Well,
lay out the background there.
Walter Cronkite got the news of the assassination from Smitty's dispatch. It started in the CBS newsroom the moment UPI's dispatch moved. Some guy in the newsroom was reading the ticker tapes and said, "Hey, look at this." And Cronkite said, "Let's get on that." Within a few minutes, they went on the air with this news. But they had to read the news from behind the slide. If you review it, you saw a slide. It said CBS News Bulletin. And the reason you saw the slide was they didn't have a camera ready in the newsroom. It took 20 or 30 minutes for a camera to warm up. And after the assassination, it's my understanding that after that, CBS always made sure, always have a camera ready to go. That's what we get.
Another component of technology that came into it was the payphone. Remember those? Will Warner, who we've heard about earlier, was dispatched by Jack Fallon.
Right.
And to use the payphone at Parkland.
That's right.
And explain to them how the technology that they allowed him to monopolize the phone.
I'm old enough to remember, and I think John's old enough to remember, that sometimes if you were out on the store and you were desperate for a phone, always a priority, you got to get a phone. These guys in Dallas that day, they were even more desperate for a phone because there were only so many phones and there were a lot of them. We needed to get this news out right away. Now, Wilbur Hampton was working in the Dallas Bureau, and soon after he took down the notes from Smitty's dispatch, they sent him to Parkland Hospital to help Smith out. And Hampton decided that he wanted to get a dedicated telephone line from the hospital to the UPI Bureau. So what he did was he went to a payphone in the hospital, he called the UPI Bureau, and he got an editor on the line. And he gave the editor the number of the payphone. He said, "Call me back." So the editor called Hampton back. And now, as long as that editor did not hang up the phone, that line would be open. And you could have gone to that phone with a pocket full of dimes, and it would have been useless to you. The only person you'd be able to talk to was that UPI editor. So that's how he snagged a payphone to make sure that UPI would be able to get news through.
It was open or it was closed. It was closed to anyone else.
It was closed to anyone else, it was open to UPI.
That's what we call a preemptive strike.
Right. Now,
There's 3 phones, you just took 1 out of action.
That's right.
It's yours.
UPI was actually first ahead of the AP on the official word of Kennedy's death. And one of the things Hampton told me was, one of the story around the UPI Bureau was supposedly that the Bureau chief's, not Jack Bell's, but the Bureau chief's wife had called in the official word of the death. But it was really, I think that was just to make the Bureau chiefs look good and to make his wife look good. It was really Hampton who got the scoop on that, and he used that phone to get that story out. And that dispatch was a couple of minutes ahead of the AP as well.
So this story is breaking, it's unfolding in real time.
Right.
As David indicated, the Zapruder film will not be seen for 12 years
Right.
before it's actually seen. Just flash onto today. What would it be like today if something like this were to transpire?
Well, you can take your phone out of your pocket, you tweet it, put it out on Twitter, and then maybe you might get on the phone with your editor and tell your editor what has just happened. Twitter is how it would get out.
Yeah.
And you have to spread socially, right? Because your Twitter stream probably only has I don't know how many Twitter followers a White House reporter has, but it's kind of limited to that. But then you want to get it out to your editors, and they'll move it out quickly.
But it's instantaneous today.
It's instantaneous.
What it was. The notion of having to use a telephone that's attached to a 5,000-pound car is the only means of communication. It's been 50 years.
Right.
It's changed that much.
Right. I think that the system that they used at the wire services in those days could move news remarkably quickly. Most Americans heard about the assassination within less than an hour. I think it was like 90%. I have that data in the book someplace. Heard about the assassination within an hour, and the UPI dispatch, that moved to 12:34, and it was on the radio only a few minutes later. So the news get out pretty quickly. What we have now is just, that story took 4 minutes. Now it would take right away.
Mm-hmm.
Now you get it out there right away.
Do you all remember where you were when you heard? Yeah. There's not a head that's not nodding. I go 5th grade class at Goswell Park School. They sent us home. So the teacher came in, the principal came in and whispered in my teacher's ear, and we were all told we could go home. And I spent the next 3 days in front of the television. So I was a witness to the Lee Harvey Oswald assassination. I was a witness to the funeral procession and everything else that transpired that day, because it was one of the most riveting events of our lifetime. Are there others you could compare to the Kennedy assassination?
I know that social scientists have compared the Kennedy assassination with 9/11. That is, as a news story, that's about the closest thing we have. I think 9/11 was as big or bigger. But that's the one I would.
Again, under very different media circumstances,
Right.
too, if you think about it. And I do think about it. The aftermath, I mean, Smitty was obviously a star in the moment,
Right.
as the story was unfolding, as it was breaking. But that was not his only gift. His second-day story, as we used to call it, was a thing of beauty.
It was a beautifully written story, and I would really like, and I think I made sure to put it in the book as an appendix, because it was so beautifully written, and it won a Pulitzer Prize, which I think was very well deserved. And it's a beautiful narrative of everything that happened that day. Smitty was also witnessed President Johnson's swearing in on Air Force One, which Jack Bell missed also. Another poor Jack Bell, he missed out on a lot of things that day. And he was invited too, he just didn't know to go along. But that story is I think still stands up today as something anybody would want to read to get a sense of what happened that day. And this came up in another event I talked about it. Today, I don't think anyone would write that story. I think we've lost, news today is all instantaneous. It's all right now. And to write a narrative of something that you'd read a day later, I think we're losing that idea.
Well, as a writer, I tended to write long, and David and Norma know what I mean. I could not have worked for a wire service because I'm a different kind of writer. He had both games. He could play the short game and the long game.
Yep.
This was a 2,800-word piece
Right.
that ran without editing.
That's right. It was reported in again, something that's come up after I wrote the book, but it was reported in Patrick Sloyan, who wrote an article for American Journalism Review, I think it was in 1998, saying it was not edited. And someone came up to me at an event a few weeks ago and said, I have a carbon copy of the original man. It was not edited. So,
Think about the complexity of the story
Yeah.
and the depth into which he went into detail. Because he was there at the hospital, he was on the plane when Johnson was sworn in. He was on the plane when it flew back, was he?
right, he stayed aboard the plane all the way back to Washington.
Yeah. So, I like to use the phrase witness to history. This is extraordinary, and I'm so glad you decided to delve into this book and tell us the backstory.
Thank you.
Now, since you're all here, and I know you're eager to ask questions, do you have any questions for Bill about the book and the ideas?
Well, just one thought. You didn't mention any photographers in the press pool, because when you talk about, in this day and age, when he saw the car,
Right.
I guess ethically you'd have to make a decision, whether you'd want to take a picture of what you saw, and were there any photographers in the press car?
This is actually interesting. This is the one thing that went right that day to the Associated Press.
This is why I want you to ask the questions instead of me.
There was a photographer for the Associated Press named James Alkins. His nickname was Ike. And he wasn't even supposed to be at Dealey Plaza that morning. They wanted him in the office to be an editor, to be a picture editor. But everybody in Dallas covering the story wanted to get in on some aspect of the president's visit. So he said, I want to go to Dealey Plaza, because from Dealey Plaza you can take this picture of the president's motorcade coming down Main Street, and you'd have a beautiful shot. You can get a long shot of the president coming towards the plaza. And they said, all right, go pursue that, see what you can do. And Alkins went to the plaza. There's a railroad trestle on the end of the plaza. He couldn't get up there. He thought that would be the best place to take a shot. He couldn't get there. So he ended up on the street next to on Elm Street, next to the book depository. The president's car came down, and Alkins was right there. He was the closest journalistic witness to the shooting. And he took several pictures. They moved on the wire within a half hour of the shooting, but he didn't get anything gruesome. He said he was so shocked that he momentarily stopped shooting, but he saw all of it. He saw the president, I'm sorry to say this, but he saw the president's brains splattered across the rear end of the car. That's what happened. He said some of it fell at his feet. And yes, those are the pictures he took.
One is,
Yeah,
and that's shooting through the windshield,
Right.
Kennedy grabbing his throat.
yes. Yeah. And he was the AP's hero that day, because he sprinted back to his office. And for some reason, the Associated Press photographers in Dallas and the writers were in separate offices. There were separate, the writers were at the Dallas Times-Herald, and the photographers were at the Dallas Morning News. So he sprinted back to the Morning News office and picked up a phone which got through to an AP editor. When Jack Bell couldn't get through, the AP wasn't sure how they were going to get the story. Well, Alkins got on the phone with the AP news editor and dictated a few lines which the AP put on its wire, and that was AP's first bulletin about the shooting, was his eyewitness account, which I think was a pretty interesting account all by itself. It was 4 sentences, more than you usually write for a bulletin, the editor said, and it's just an interesting thing. But he was the guy who got the story to the AP.
Well, I have to, he just said something I think that was very interesting.
Okay.
And this has to do with the car.
Right.
He just said a bullet hole in the windshield.
Oh, no, the photographer shot through the windshield.
Oh, okay. I thought there was a bullet hole in the
No.
windshield.
No.
That would change a lot.
That is just the other thought having to do with the photographer with the car.
Right.
With here you have a piece of a crime scene, which that car was, and there wasn't a lot of pictures, there wasn't a lot of evidence. As you know, Johnson had the car cleaned, and I don't think there was ever any extensive examination of what happened there.
They cleaned the car in the hospital ambulance bag. The Secret Service agent did it pretty much right away. I don't think they did it on purpose. I think they just thought that was the thing to do.
Yeah.
There's a movie coming out very soon with Natalie Portman called Jackie, which will perpetuate this story into another generation.
Now, I saw the movie the other night. I'm trying to keep up with all this stuff. Interesting part of the movie, this is the opening scene of the book, I decided. Jackie Kennedy gave an interview a week after the assassination with Theodore H. White. It was a very famous interview, and this is the interview in which she put forward the idea of the Camelot myth. Now, during that interview, when they set up the interview, she talked about two reporters. She talked about Arthur Kroc, who was a journalist for the New York Times, and she talked about Merriman Smith. And then, during the interview itself, she mentioned only one reporter during that interview, Merriman Smith. She didn't like him. She called him a bitter old man, even though he was just 2 years older than her husband. And she worried a lot about what Merriman Smith was going to write about her husband's legacy. And this is why we have the Camelot myth. A big part of it is because Jackie Kennedy didn't like Merriman Smith. This comes out in Theodore White's notes. She just didn't trust the guy to write the story of her husband's legacy that she wanted written. She could trust Theodore White to write that story. She couldn't trust me.
There were times, in New Hampshire, for example, there were so many stories that you think have been told. Robert Frost. When am I going to write about Robert Frost? Everything about Robert Frost has been written. If you don't know, he delivered the poem at JFK's inauguration. And if you remember that day, it had snowed in Washington. It was a bitter cold day. And he had handwritten a poem to John F. Kennedy to read for the inauguration. And JFK actually didn't want him to speak because he was afraid he would steal the show. Robert Frost was a charming old coot who knew how to live in the moment. So on that morning, he gets up to the podium. He gets up to the podium after the swearing in, and he was going to read this poem to JFK on his inauguration. And when he looked down at the white-lined paper upon which he'd written by hand, 83 years old, cataracts, all of a sudden the bright reflection off the snow, he can't see the words. So without anyone knowing, he recited a poem from memory called The Gift Outright, which was about how the land was ours before we were the land's, how we came here as settlers and lived on the land but weren't a part of it. And it fit perfectly with the new frontier that Kennedy was proposing. And after November 22nd, 1963, the Oval Office was cleaned out in a hurry. And that framed poem that he had given to Kennedy was framed on the wall in the Oval Office, and it was gone. And it was gone for almost 50 years. They were cleaning out some boxes in the JFK library a few years back, and somebody said, "Hey, what's this?" and pulled out the framed poem, the handwritten poem that Robert Frost had written. So my point in telling that story is not to show how good my memory is, but to show you that every good story lives on. And when you think it's told, you find another wrinkle, and that's what you've done. You've looked at the story from yet another angle. What madness possessed you?
Just interest, curiosity about it.
Yeah.
I just got interested in this story, and I knew that a lot of reporters made their reputations in Dallas one way or another that day, but somehow Smitty was the man. He was the guy who really got the story, and people have forgotten about him. He died in 1970 of his own hand, and when I started thinking, well, he didn't talk about the assassination much afterwards, but he did really. He was very interested in the conspiracy theories, none of which he liked. He didn't buy into any of them. He also suffered, he had nightmares after the assassination. A year later, he was in a psychiatric hospital dealing with his terrible drinking problem and with some mental health issues. I don't try to diagnose the guy, but he definitely had problems.
A form of post-traumatic stress of some kind.
His family thinks maybe, but nobody really sure.
You talk about journalists who made their name on that day. I mean, Bob Schieffer,
right,
a reporter in Dallas. Dan Rather was reporting in Dallas at the time. A remarkable roll call of journalists.
I don't think I got into Schieffer. Dan Rather's story was kind of interesting. He got the scoop. He worked together with a reporter in Dallas to figure out that the president was dead, and he had several sources telling him so. They put it on. He gave this to the CBS newsroom, and the radio side of the newsroom. When they got this news from Dan Rather, they put the national anthem on the air, which Dan Rather thought, well, that's not really right. But Walter Cronkite handled it by just reading what Dan Rather had reported, which was he had some sources saying the president died, but the news wasn't official yet.
a remarkable time in history. I'm sorry.
You mentioned, I believe Bill O'Reilly was involved in that as well. Was he a reporter from the Dallas Morning News?
No,
He's a little bit younger than that.
Yeah.
I know, but he did write the book Killing Kennedy, so he's managed to
It's
make some
listed,
money
I
on
thought it
it.
was listed in one of his books that he's considered a reporter.
I think he may have applied his repertorial skills to writing the book Killing Kennedy. He's done Killing Pat, and he's done
Right, yeah, I know.
Reagan. He's got a franchise now. And it would not be unlike Bill O'Reilly to inject himself into the Kennedy assassination.
there's another.
Fair and balanced to me.
There's a small New Hampshire story in the book about Sherman Adams. And Smith got the scoop on Sherman Adams and President Eisenhower's decision to fire Sherman Adams as his chief of staff. Sherman Adams was governor of New Hampshire, and he wound up being Eisenhower's chief of staff. And I didn't get into the book, but there was one other publication that also got that story. Really, and it was Laconia Evening Citizen. The Laconia Evening Citizen and American Smith were the two reporters, were the two organizations that had that
Sort
story.
of. I'm sure you all remember that when Sherman Adams served as chief of staff for
Right.
President Eisenhower, he was under attack for accepting a vicuna coat, which is a rare and exotic animal. And it started an investigation,
Right.
a series of allegations of corruption against Sherman Adams, who ultimately resigned.
Right.
Under
Well, he was
duress.
fired. He was fired.
He was fired.
Yes.
But ironically, Eisenhower never would have been president if not for Sherman Adams. In 1952, as we were gearing up for the presidential primary here in New Hampshire, Eisenhower was still working at NATO. And he didn't know if he was a Republican or a Democrat, he claimed. But Sherman Adams, the governor of New Hampshire, knew he would make a damn fine Republican president. So it was Sherman Adams who registered Dwight Eisenhower to run in the New Hampshire primary. And when he won, he decided that, hey, maybe I should do this, run for president. So he finally came to New Hampshire in October of 27th of the election year 1952. So he never came here during the primary, but he came just before the general election at the behest of Sherman Adams. All of it was because of him. So there's always a New Hampshire angle. That's our mantra, David.
I had the experience last night of listening to a couple of hours of Kennedy assassination audio tapes to make the audio that was on when you came in, and learned from those tapes that Johnson was shot, that Johnson had a heart attack, and that a Secret Service agent was killed, none of which were true. What other things in all of the jumble of what went on that day, what other things came out that ended up not being true, other than the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was the only shooter? No. But those three things stood out, that Johnson was shot,
Right.
then he had a heart attack, and then a Secret Service agent was also killed. in
I think
Rogers.
those are the main things, and I think mostly they were reported by the AP, although I'm sorry.
He did say that.
Those are the three main things that I can think of that reporters got wrong that day. Now, the part about Johnson having been shot, some of the audio quotes, I think Bob Clark, the ABC News reporter, reported that, and I suspect, I don't know this, but I suspect that the AP took it from there. But Clark was like kind of vague about where he was hearing it. He was reporting from the hospital. And I'm not sure, I don't think that really met anybody's standards. That wasn't quite the way it worked. The AP bureau chief in Dallas that day, a guy named Bob Johnson, he felt that, well, that was the one thing he screwed up. We shouldn't have reported that Johnson was shot. The rest of it, he felt like he did pretty well with.
But in the heat of the moment, as David indicated, John Connolly and Lyndon Johnson, both tall, lanky Texans,
Right.
and the presumption might be on some people that the president, vice president would ride together, which obviously would be anathema.
Right.
They would not do that.
Could be.
So it could have been a presumption or an assumption. And what do we do when we assume? Don't do that.
What did you find to be your most useful sources for the story? Whether paper copies or historical sources or individuals?
Smitty left behind his papers at the University of Wisconsin, so I went out there and spent a few days going through those. They were very helpful. His family was very helpful in providing, his son kept synopses of all the letters that he wrote to the family. He wouldn't give me the letters, but he said, I have this, for years he's been building up this sort of account of all the letters that his dad had written. It was something like 35 pages long. So I got a lot of information from his family. And the Associated Press part, I have to tell you, I got it from the Associated Press archives in New York. They let me in and showed me all this stuff. So it's most of the stuff about the AP that day comes from the AP itself.
That's a great question, because I'm part of a team that teaches a course here at the Loeb School called Telling Your Family Story. And we talk about resources that you can use when your grandfather or grandmother are gone, but you want to tell the family story. So what do you have? So we talk about primary sources, secondary sources, and paper trails, and the kind of evocative things you can use to get that story out. And it sounds like that's a great repertorial path to follow.
I feel like I lucked out. I knew that one of his children told me, well, Dad left his letters behind. And she wasn't even sure where they were. And I dug around and found out the University of Wisconsin. So I felt fortunate that I was able to find them. And I'm glad he left them behind, because some Helen Thomas, I would have loved to have seen some of her stuff. She and Smitty were very good friends, and I would have loved to have seen some of the things she had to say, but I can't find her stuff anywhere.
More questions?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that in this moment, this is a flash moment of history, that a reporter's instincts kicked in immediately. It was like they all wanted the scoop, or they wanted to be first, seeking sources, like right there on the spot, when the whole world, as we all remember, we were stunned. I mean, there was such a somber mood in this country. But the reporters, as you have been telling, have been running around newsrooms and making phone calls and fighting for the phone.
Right.
I think it's just very interesting that those instincts kicked in.
And his instincts were better than anybody's.
Yeah.
He had the best instincts. Some of his friends today will tell you that he was the greatest wire service reporter who ever lived. That may be the case.
The instinct thing is not incorrect, and both David and Norman can address it as well. Here in New Hampshire, we think about the Carl Drager shootings up north, in which people all over New Hampshire reacted. People were in cars. You could not tell that story from Manchester. You had to be there. And unfortunately, when they got there was no cell service in the North Country. So everybody was fighting for the payphones that they could find. The Challenger disaster was another concussive story here in New Hampshire, in which everybody had to help tell the story. Two reporters from New Hampshire, Bob Kohler and Sean Wickham, Bob Kohler from the Monitor and Sean Wickham from the Sunday News, were both there. And to see, David was there as well? Yeah. And to see how they reacted on foreign turf, they were in Florida. The way they scrambled to try to find ways to cover that story is a testament to that. There are reporters' instincts, and sometimes you don't know whether you have or not until it's that moment of truth. And we've been lucky here in New Hampshire that we've had people who've had that.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Did he say anything about when he got word of the fact that Oswald had been arrested in the movie theater? I mean, I'm thinking that he's on the plane. I don't know whether the plane had left yet or not, but you can see that he's thinking probably, I'd like to be there when they're, and see who this guy is and all of that.
I think at that point he felt it was a story for someone else. Smitty didn't have anything to do with covering the Oswald business. I put a chapter about Oswald in the book because I thought about the Oswald and the Jack Ruby shooting in the book, because I thought, well, people will want to read this, and there's some interesting things about journalism to the way that all unfolded. But Smitty wasn't involved in covering that story.
And the Ruby story, the next day, again, we were all sitting in front of the television, and we were witness to a murder live on television. That should have been foreseen, it should have been prevented.
Right.
Through any measure whatsoever, that should not have been allowed to happen. For what it's worth, Stephen King wrote a book about the Kennedy assassination, called November 22nd, 1963, about time travel. And it's an allegory, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
If you haven't read it, when you read it, know that the bad guy named John Clayton is no relation to him. I may have offended Stephen King at a book signing he and I did jointly at one point, but I thought it odd that the bad guy was named John Clayton in the book. So.
I find it odd that the evil town in Stephen King's books is called Derry.
Yeah.
I think he has an in for New Hampshire.
I worked at the Daily News. I had nothing to do with it.
Bill, did Smitty have a breakdown moment afterward? Not a falling apart breakdown, but you mentioned the instincts, and you mentioned Challenger. And you go, and then there's a moment where you don't have to go, and you sit down and you think, what did I just see today? And you start crying. I mean, did he have that moment?
He had nightmares, and I think he described them in a story he wrote for UPI about this around the time the Warren Commission report came out. And I think it hit him after he got done covering the funeral. he says as much. He just, he took, he said, there's a scene in the book that talks about this. He took off his morning clothes and just went to sleep, and he said, and then I started having nightmares. And he sought help for this. He sought help for his problem with nightmares. He said he just couldn't, he had a very hard time dealing with it in the months afterwards.
In the book, you talk about the fact that there are too few journalists
Yes.
in the world today, and too few who may gain the benefit of the experience that Smitty gained through
Yes.
years of doing his job, to the best of his ability. What can we do? Norma's retired, I'm retired, Dave's retired from journalism. How can this new generation of reporters embrace the gifts they have in terms of technology and uphold the standards that we were all raised on?
I'm really scared. I don't really know where any of this is going to come from. I started out, my first job was in the paper in Peterborough, the weekly paper, and that's where I learned these things. And I don't know who's left to teach these things anymore. I'm really nervous about that. I worked for a long time at the New York Post, and nowadays I go in one day a week as an editor, and sometimes I work with the younger reporters on their stories, and I'm finding that the younger ones I work with are very hungry for some instruction and some guidance about how to do these things. I think they get it at the Post from whatever editors they're working with, but I don't know where it's coming anywhere else. I just don't.
I think it's going to come from your telling the story, the family stories, and what people actually lived in writing their stories when they remember, and later people will read their words. I think that's where a lot of that won't be at the time.
But I'm also worried about, we don't have, Norma covered state government in New Hampshire for all those years. And I've been a State House reporter in 2 states. I did it in New Hampshire before Norma got here. And I did it in New Jersey for several years. And I'm really afraid about that kind of coverage. I'm really afraid about city halls and police stations and courthouses. Today I saw a news item that the New York Times is going to have 6 reporters assigned to cover the Trump White House, and Politico is going to have 7. There are going to be plenty of people covering the story in Washington, but I'm worried that there aren't going to be enough people covering the story in Concord and where I did in Trenton and in other places, and I'm worried about courts and the school boards and all these other things. That is the thing that I think is really losing.
The fundamentals of our democracy.
Yes.
Essentially. Yep.
What I was going to say was that it's hard to maintain trust and honesty and good reporting when there's so much. We've been hearing a lot about fake reporting today, and so that's an obstacle good reporters have to surf through themselves.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's always been fake reporting of some kind, and I don't know. I just don't know. I think it starts from the ground. If I'm covering the local council, or if I'm covering the cops, or if I'm covering the courts, and I live in a town, I can assess myself how good a job the reporter's doing. I might know people, or I might know what's going on. And I think if you can trust the local people, you maybe have a better understanding of what you're reading out of Washington and out of other parts of the world. Does that make sense?
It does, and if you didn't see, there was an interview that Jake Tapper from CNN conducted with Mike Pence, the Vice President-elect, in which Jake Tapper was getting all this laudatory compliments because he kept insisting that Mike Pence answer the question, which he kept trying to talk around. And this went on to the point of uncomfortable, and he did it for 15 minutes. And so Jake Tapper's getting all these pats on the back, and the Times wrote an editorial saying, this should not be the exception. This is what should happen on everything. You don't give them a forum to tell their truth. You give them a forum to answer the questions that you ask. And so that was the message the Times says going forward. It should always be like that, if only it were so. I don't know that that will be the case. They'll pick and choose the media that they want to appear on, the ones that hang the curveball questions that they can get out of the park, and they simply won't take bookings with the ones who ask hard questions. So it's a different time that we've talked about, not just the one phone in the 5,000-pound car, but how we address these important issues that we want to hold people accountable. That's part of our job as journalists, is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. That's the cliche. It's becoming harder and harder to do that because people have their own media now. And whether it be fake news or answering the questions they choose to answer, It's going to be harder for journalists to do the kind of work that Merriman Smith did when he reported on what happened right in front of his eyes. There's no spinning that story.
Speaking of that car phone, I'm just curious, did they ever figure out how it went mysteriously dead?
Some people thought that Smitty had tapped the cradle. In fact, Bob Johnson, the AP bureau chief in Dallas, claimed that someone at UPI told him that that's what had happened. But I don't know who the someone was. And Helen Thomas mentioned this in one of her books, that she thinks the story about Smitty tapping the cradle was apocryphal. She didn't believe it. So, who knows? I think a lot of things could have gone wrong.
Still a mystery.
It's still a mystery.
Thank you.
Can we do one more?
It's so interesting to look at it in 2016, huh? It would have been thousands and thousands of camera shots and movies. I remember sitting, and it seemed like 24 hours a day. Was that the first coverage, TV coverage, that extensive with the riderless horse and the...
Yeah, people say this. I didn't get into the TV coverage too much because I wanted to focus on Smitty, but that's the story. Some people say that, well, the TV coverage really kind of made its bones that day, but I'm not. I think there were some other stories over the years. I mean, TV was evolving, and I'm not sure that if the assassination had happened or not, I think it would have moved in the direction it moved anyways.
So I think about the indelible images that come from that weekend, because it was all weekend into Monday with the funeral and the riderless horse and John salute. Those are emblazoned in our memories forever. And it's painful to go back and look at it and think back on it. But I think a book like Bill's just sheds more light on it. And there's a thing about more smoke than fire. This is fire. This is the real stuff. So thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Point you mentioned Frank Cormier.
Right.
His son Bill
Right.
worked at the AP bureau in Concord when Norma and I were there, so we got some of the inside track on Frank. And wanted to thank Neil Valentino, a student here at the Loeb School, who has a massive collection of historic front pages, and here are a few of his Kennedy front pages for you to take a look at. Miriam Smith is the front page on the far left. The AP photographer who called in the actual blood on the head, I heard Mrs. Kennedy yell, "Oh no," photos are on some of those pages as well. The grabbing the phone and diving on the floor, we haven't grabbed the phone and hidden under the floor, but we've all done it. You had to do it, especially when there was one payphone. And you dictate something and while UPI or the other guy is waiting for it, say, read that back to me. No, I didn't say that, read, and it's gone. There's nobody on the other end of the phone. And I'm saying, no, that isn't it. And I say it again, just to hold on to the phone longer. You do it. It was part of the fun of having the competition.
And there's nothing like dictating off the top of your head on the phone.
It was fun.
Get me Clayton. I want somebody who can type fast and I can talk.
Bill has copies of his book here, which are for sale for $20, which is a discount of the list price, and is donating part of his take to the Loeb School, so we can continue providing events like this. And thank you all very much for coming. John mentioned telling a family story. That is a neat workshop. It's a one-day workshop. John talks about how he tells his stories. Fritz Weatherby talks about the idea is how do you get the information and then how do you turn it around and tell a story. John, Fritz Weatherby, Meg Heckman, who won awards for a nice series she did when she was at the Concord Monitor on World War II veterans. Videographer John Graffair talks about how to put it all on tape. And Laurie Fisher, who is an archivist, will scare you to death about how you're ruining your pictures by storing them in your attic or your basement, which is where everyone stores their pictures. And she'll tell you why you're ruining your pictures. So that's coming up, I think, on March 11th. But it's all on our website. And thank you again for coming tonight. Some refreshments still in the back. And John and Bill would, I'm sure, love to hear from you afterwards. So come on up. Thank you.
Thank you.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.